including Allen Ginsberg, Anne Waldman, Amiri Baraka, Eileen Miles, and countless others. Patti Smith gave her first public poetry reading and performance here. Sam Shepard's early plays were staged here. Khalil Gibran read The Prophet for the first time here. Experimental artists, musicians, dancers, and playwrights have found a home here for generations. And at the same time, this church has been a gathering place for movements seeking a more just and compassionate world. People have come here not only to create art, but to wrestle with what it means to be human together. We are so, so deeply honored today to welcome Ben Rhodes and Bishop Matthew Hyde for a conversation about Ben's new book, All We Say. Can you join me in welcoming Ben and Matt? Many people know Ben through his years serving as Deputy National Security Advisor and speechwriter for President Barack Obama, where he helped shape some of the most consequential speeches and foreign policy initiatives of the last generation. He's also the author of the best-selling books, The World as It Is and After the Fall. He's a commentator, podcast host, and public intellectual, and an excellent, excellent writer. And I have to say, right before this talk, somebody came up to me and said, "How did you get Ben Rhodes? He could literally be anywhere else except for here. How did you get him here?" So I'm delighted to share that Ben grew up in the church and was a longtime participant in the epic Heavenly Rest Christmas pageant, which is a pageant, yes. A pageant that Bishop Matt and I both had the great honor to support when we served there together. One of the things that runs through Ben's work is a fascination with the stories that nations tell about themselves, how words shape identity, how public language can inspire or deceive, how generations inherit hopes, fears, aspirations, and unfinished work from those who came before them. In a recent essay, Ben reflected on walking late at night to the Lincoln Memorial during his years at the White House, something he did often, and reading Lincoln's second inaugural address and searching for what he called the currents that run beneath American life. He says that speeches are never simply about the moment in which they are delivered. They are conversations across generations, between past and present, between who we have been and who we hope to become. He writes, "This is precisely the time to look somewhere other than the present for hope." At St. Mark's, we have long understood that we are called to be part of this kind of conversation, a conversation that draws us back and calls us forward at the same time. We know that the whole church has a critical role to play, both in reminding us who we are as human beings and also in helping to shape the narrative for a more just future. As you know, Bishop Matthew Hyde serves as the 17th Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of New York. He's a leading voice in our city and across the Episcopal Church. Bishop Matt has helped the whole church step forward to be a place of moral clarity, moral courage, and moral imagination. Bishop Matt's leadership is contagious because his story for the church and the world is hope. He defines his ministry as the renewal of the church for the healing of the world. And there's no better mission for all of us than that in these times. He's also an example of a leader who does not only preach and teach about who we are and who we're called to be, but who actually embodies a more just world in his kindness and care for everyone he meets. So again, welcome to St. Mark's. I'm so excited for this conversation. Thank you all for being here, and please join me again in welcoming Ben Rhodes and Matthew. Just a couple quick housekeeping things. There are restrooms on either side of the church in the back. There are books available for purchase after the conversation. We'll also have some refreshments in the back. Please be comfortable. And we'll also have a little time for questions at the end. So if you have questions, I'll come around with a microphone and we'll take a couple at the end.
Well, thank you, and thank you for coming this evening. Start by saying thank you to Anne-Marie Witchker for her leadership. and to St. Mark's in the Bowery for hosting. I can't imagine a better place than St. Mark's to have this conversation. Also, Ben's parents are here. Jim and Jane Rhodes. Well, so it does feel like this book is exactly the right book for exactly this moment. But why? Why? You're writing all the time. We hear you on podcasts every week. You've been working on this book for several years. Why this book? Why now?
Well, first of all, thank you, Anne-Marie, for hosting. I am a little daunted by Patti Smith and Allen Ginsberg, but Matt and I will try our best here. And I never did get beyond like Shepherd number 4 in the Christmas pageant.
By the way, Shepherd number 4 is the most important shepherd.
yeah. It's just no solos. So the origin story for this book was when I was writing my last book. It was about the rise of authoritarianism around the world. And I kind of profiled different versions of the same disease that has been spreading. And so I looked at not just Donald Trump in this country, but Vladimir Putin in Russia, and Viktor Orban in Hungary, and Xi Jinping in China. And yes, part of what I was looking at is like, what is the playbook by which you consolidate authoritarian rule? But what I kept finding is how central history was to that project. That essentially a certain type of leader needs to go back and tell a story in which all of history is a prequel, essentially, to their ascension. Just to take Putin, he spent a lot of time telling a story about the fall of the Soviet Union and the weakness of Russia that led conveniently to him being a strongman. And so I had, as a speechwriter for Barack Obama, he had been always very conscious of history, and he, in a number of ways, first he used to always say, our main job in storytelling politically is to try to tell the best story about America, and also to situate himself in a continuum of the American past that encompassed the civil rights movement and the abolitionist movement, and so I always felt like there were these kind of currents of history that I was trying imperfectly, because when you're in political power, you're always compromising, but trying to situate what we were doing in that continuum, what I would say the kind of continuum of progressive nationalism in this country's history. And it struck me, as I was thinking about what I wanted to write, that in a lot of ways, if you look at Donald Trump and Barack Obama, they kind of embody two stories that have been in competition with one another throughout our country's history. And again, this is not me trying to say Obama's perfect, but writ large, Trump kind of represents an exclusive nationalism and an inherited nationalism. We are we're the inheritors of kind of Western supremacy, and we are frankly, kind of a white Christian nation that has other people here, but those other people have kind of been subordinate to the predominant identity. And Obama was out of the tradition that says, we've never lived up to what we said we were going to be in the Declaration of Independence about equality. And basically every movement for change in this country's history has been about trying to close the gap between what we said we were and what we are. And that was basically the idea for the book, that if I could find a number of speeches that showed this competition and how we've adjudicated it through language and through words, and how those speeches have both reflected moments and changed the direction of events, it could offer a better way to understand what's happening now. And it's frankly just a very good time to escape the present by living in the past as well.
So how do you go about choosing the speeches?
So that was it took me 4 years to write this book, and the first year was entirely dedicated to choosing the speeches. And I must have read, hundreds of them. And what unlocked it for me is I knew I didn't want like the greatest hits album. This is not an anthology. You'll see each chapter is not just the speech, it's the life of the person and the movement that produced the person and what was happening in the country at the time. And so I wanted a representative collection that would allow me to tell a single story. And the speech that unlocked it for me was Benjamin Franklin's speech at the Constitutional Convention, because Franklin was chosen to give the closing argument at the Constitution, and he didn't say anything about the Constitution. It's fascinating. He only gave a speech defending the virtue of compromise. And his point was, if you assemble a group of people that have different wisdom but also different prejudices, different interests, you can't get a perfect product. Not everybody's going to find something they don't like about it. And actually, that's all he says about the Constitution is negative. You know, there's going to be things in here that none of us like. But this is the best we can do, and if we can't compromise, we can't have a constitution. Notably, he invokes religion, Matt, because he says, basically, we all came here because we lived in systems where everybody believed that they had a monopoly on truth. And he compares the infallibility of the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church, and he's making the point that they both can't be right, you know, not in the sense that we can't all live together if we insist in dogma. Now, that allowed the United States to happen. That's the genius of it. The problem with it is they compromised about very big things. Chief among them, slavery. Also, kind of the nature of citizenship. Immigration was not addressed. Each state had a different immigration policy. And essentially, that set in motion all of the arguments we've been having. And the first 5 speeches were fascinating to kind of curate, because from that moment of compromise, I moved to a Seneca chief who gives a speech. It's essentially about the fact that, hey, we've been left out of your project. Would you please leave us alone? Then I have an abolitionist woman named Maria Stewart, who was in 1830s Boston, and she gives a speech demanding not just black equality, but she was a feminist too. And she's saying, well, we need to be a part of this story too. Black people and women have been left out, and we need to claim our rights. Then the 4th speech is Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederacy, who gives a speech saying the quiet part out loud. He says, you know, white supremacy is the cornerstone of our nation, and frankly, the problem with the Constitution is it didn't make clear enough that this is a nation rooted in white supremacy. And then Lincoln gives a speech aiming to resolve it, saying we fought a war for abolition, and now we're a multiracial democracy. And I tell those 5 because it's all right there, you know. And then, remarkably, even though the issues are different, the debate just repeats itself. The same arguments from similar perspectives repeat itself. So each speech is meant to illuminate kind of one piece of how different people have argued about what it means to be American and who gets to decide who's an American.
You talked about President Obama's sense of the currents of history and your participation in that. Did you go into choosing the speeches with the sense that that was the debate you'd find, or did you find the debate as you read the speeches?
That's a great question. I knew that I was going to find at core these 2 stories. Like I had in my mind, again, there are 2 ideas of American exceptionalism, essentially, right? There's an idea that we're exceptional because we're American, you know, and that allows us to do whatever we want. And whether that's to Native Americans or to black people or to Chinese laborers or what have you. And then there's an exceptionalism that is about struggle and trying to close that gap. I think what I was surprised to find is, well, there are a lot of things, but to just highlight a couple, the way the stories interact and can surprise you. So, for instance, I selected a populist named Mary Lease, who gave this speech in the 1890s. She was like the leading populist orator. And she used to barnstorm the countries, giving these blistering speeches. And she gave this speech called, you know, Wall Street owns this country. This is a country of, by, and for Wall Street. And, you know, the Bernie Sanders in me was like, you tell it, Mary Lease, you know. Then she talked about the fact that, and the white working class of the North and South need to unite because we've gotten sidetracked by all this focus on black political rights, and there shouldn't be any immigrants in this country and no foreign ownership of land. And she even proposed colonizing Latin America and setting up plantations. Populism in this country has a pretty interesting history because that speech doesn't fit neatly on our ideological spectrum because it's very left-wing economics and very right-wing xenophobia. And so throughout, I kind of kept, and even Maria Stewart from a different perspective, you know, in 1830s, before the word intersectionality existed, she was making an argument that for black people to be empowered, they needed to focus on the empowerment of women because the situation of marginalized people was inherently connected. And so I kept finding people that were, you know, forging their own connections or taking from both stories or redirecting history, like nudging those currents in different directions. You know, that's the thing about America is it's so big and complex because these questions were unanswered at the beginning, that people had to kind of make it up as they went along. You know, they had to invent American identity through these speeches. And again, the reason I think speeches are so, it's not just I'm a speechwriter, I'm obviously biased there, but a speech is, unlike, you know, a piece of writing, you're trying to persuade or you're trying to mobilize. I was struck that everybody in this speech was deeply connected to a movement of some kind. And so speeches are both like history in the present tense. You know, they don't know how it's going to turn out. They're also uniquely about trying to kind of speak an identity into being. One other thing I'd just say that surprised me is that it changed how I thought about history in some ways, because the example I give is Frederick Douglass, the speech I chose by Douglass, the Composite Nation speech he gave in 1867. And its reconstruction seems like Douglass is at his high watermark. Blacks have just been given suffrage. The Civil War's obviously ended. And he gives a speech not about race, as we traditionally think about it. He gave a speech in defense of Chinese immigration. And at that time, there were Chinese laborers indentured on railroads and on farms in California and other places, and they were terribly mistreated. This would probably poll at 10%, you know. It was not a wise political thing to do. But Douglass's argument was, if I believe in multiracial democracy, if I actually believe in equality, I have to stand up for a Chinese person in a way that I would have liked people to stand up for me. It's a brilliant, beautiful speech, but the reason I bring it up is, on the surface, Douglass failed. You know, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed shortly thereafter, banning any Chinese people from coming into this country for decades. So you can look at this and say, well, poor Frederick Douglass, Reconstruction failed, the Chinese Exclusion Act gets passed. But look around America today. How many Chinese Americans are there? How many Asian Americans are there? That there's something about the effort that people like that made, that even if they didn't see the fruit of the tree, they planted seeds that endured after them. And it made me kind of see the arc of American history, particularly in this moment that we're in, differently. That actually, if people like that hadn't gotten up and made arguments like that, and even though they were going to lose, that we might not have the America that we're in today.
Speak an American identity into being is a powerful phrase, and you've written about it, you've analyzed it, but you've done it at the highest levels. How did that change how you read these speeches, and how do you appreciate, as someone who has written speeches for President Obama, you speak yourself, the appreciation of how they shifted the narrative, how they shaped narrative through words?
Yeah, so, you know, when you work for Barack Obama for 8 years and then Donald Trump's elected after you, you have a kind of a journey. And I'm still going through it, but I'd say there have been phases to it that really informed this book. The first phase of grief was, you know, to know that Trump was going to come in and dismantle a lot of the things that I worked on. And so, the things I thought of as the legacy I was a part of. I mean, I'm probably the only person on earth, I am, who can claim to have both worked on the Iran nuclear agreement and then negotiated the normalization of relations with Cuba. And now I'm watching one war with Iran and preparing for the next war with Cuba, And I had an instinct in 2017, not maybe that would happen, but that those things would be taken apart. Then I started to think about the Americans, that I admired growing up. And one of them, just to take one, was John F. Kennedy. We were, my parents were here, we're Kennedy devotees, and I realized that, I couldn't name you when I was a kid any legislation that John F. Kennedy passed, but I knew the words of some of his speeches, and I knew that he kind of, for all of his flaws, of which there are many, so I'm not here to carry water for everything about John F. Kennedy, but that he represented something that unleashed a certain force, into the American subconscious about the future and about progress and about liberalism as it was changing in the 60s. And I realized that Obama's legacy, whenever it's all said and done, and it never is all said and done, was probably going to be far more about who he was and what he said than even anything he did. Then the second phase was, I think, as someone who's probably an unlikely person who've ended up in the White House, I didn't seek it out. A few accidents led me onto that campaign. I had to kind of divorce power and become suspicious of it again. I think that it's essential that good people seek political power. So I don't encourage everybody to walk away from it, but I was too inside of the machine, especially on things like foreign policy that I worked on. And I really had to spend years kind of intentionally almost deprogramming myself to look at power from the outside in again. And to see, and when I was able to do that, which again, I don't claim to have fully done that, but, in this book, I could see not the cliche version of, well, there's no Barack Obama without Martin Luther King and Frederick Douglass, but the actual centrality of activism and movement building to any hope of political power being representative. So I know it's a kind of strange answer, but it's a personal answer in the sense that, I learned a lot about the power of narrative and storytelling and political storytelling, and I believe deeply in it, and I believe we need it more than we have it right now. But I also believe that you can't get so stuck inside of the power dynamic that you lose sight of the fact that most of the progress in this country's history began with people that were profoundly outside of those power structures and forced their way in. And I hope that that's reflected in the book.
So you created a frame of 15 speeches. If you'd expanded it to 17 or 20, what are the ones that didn't quite make the cut, but maybe you wish you could have included? And are there voices in all your readings that you were surprised didn't show up across American history?
So there are a couple that didn't show up for very specific reasons. I actually, we can come back to the Selma one because I know you were interested in that. But for instance, I had written a whole chapter on Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan gave a speech in 1992 at the Republican National Convention that is kind of the opening salvo in the culture wars. It's literally shorthanded the culture war speech. Pat Buchanan ran for president in 1992, demanding that we build a wall on the southern border to keep all immigrants out. His campaign platform was called America First. He wanted to impose tariffs on other countries. He wanted to get out of any foreign entanglements. He wanted to outlaw abortion. You see what I'm getting at.
Sounds somewhat familiar.
Yeah. Pat Buchanan was not so enthusiastic about being included in a collection of speeches that Ben Rhodes was going to write about. So I was literally denied permission for that speech. But then Trump got elected, and I just ended the book with Trump's second inaugural and used all my Pat Buchanan material to inform that chapter. So that was one. I think when I look back on it, as I wound back the clock, another thing that I wanted to include more of were speeches by women, and I was, maybe I should not have been surprised. People did not write speeches down by women until relatively recently. Maria Stewart, who I mentioned, is only in this book because she used her pension to self-publish her own speeches before she died. Mary Lease, who I mentioned, no whole text of her speech exists. It's just an excerpt that was reprinted in a newspaper, even though she was a very famous orator. I spent a lot of time searching for speeches by women, and was struck by the extent to which they were almost deliberately not included in any canon. If you look at any compilation of speeches by prominent Americans that was published, before, say, World War II, you might find one or two here and there. And I mention that because I think that's notable, the extent to which, because actually, then when you read the histories, women were absolutely central to every movement for progressive change in this country's history. They usually funded it. They usually participated in it. They published the newspapers that Frederick Douglass was recorded in. They organized. They spoke. And they did that within a society that didn't think it was worth recording their words, So that was another thing that I encountered. And then, I deliberately did not want to have a lot of presidents. I didn't want it to be president heavy. And so there are people that I might otherwise have included. For instance, Franklin's in there. None of the other, no Jefferson, no Hamilton, no Madison. I wanted to tilt a bit more towards activists.
Talk about the complicated role of American religion in these two currents, these two narratives.
Well, I was telling you, Matt, before, I was really struck by how central faith traditions were. So just to take like a quick journey in it, in the Franklin chapter, he's obviously a Pennsylvanian. The Quakers were a huge influence on Franklin, including that Franklin started out owning a slave. His newspapers advertised for slaves sales, including the separation of families. But the Quakers went to work on Franklin. And by the end of his life, he was an abolitionist. And actually, I think one of the more powerful things in the book is Franklin, after giving the speech on compromise and saying we have to live with this Constitution, his first public act after the Constitution and the formation of the new government is to petition Congress to abolish slavery. And it's Franklin demonstrating this is how this is not, Franklin is not an originalist, for those who know that term. This Constitution is not right and needs to be fixed, but I believe it should be fixed within the confines of this democracy we set up. Without the Quakers, you don't get Benjamin Franklin to that place. Then the religiosity of the Great Awakening. All of the movements, including abolitionism, that emerged in the first half of the 19th century had some origin in that idea that people were seeking a deeper spirituality and a deeper sense of meaning. Like Maria Stewart was a deeply, deeply faithful person who literally thought that she'd been called by God to raise her voice. Why is this black woman who had no money showing up in the office of William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, and demanding to be heard. And that was entirely her faith, in her view. And that led me into this idea of the Black church, which, as I wrote this book, emerged in my mind as kind of the conscience of the whole country. And the prophetic tradition of the Black church in particular. There's a kind of speech called the Jeremiad, right, which is you call out the nation's sins for the purposes of redeeming it. And every speech, from Douglas to King, if you know about the Black church, you understand their message so much better, because it is fundamentally a message of atonement and redemption. And frankly, it made me understand, in my Obama chapters about the speech he gave in reaction to the controversy over Jeremiah Wright, his pastor who gave these speeches that got clipped on YouTube and were made to look, scary to people. Well, first of all, those clips are Reverend Wright saying things like America's a racist nation, and from the context of today, suddenly Jeremiah Wright looks, maybe like he had a few points. But also, like, that voice of Jeremiah Wright runs back to Maria Stewart, so the continuum that I saw there. And then, Matt, the only thing, there's so many things we could say about this, including the extent to which Lincoln's evolution towards abolitionism was entirely spiritual. It was political too, but at core it was spiritual, because he was trying to surmise what is God's design. And what he concluded in the most radical sentence ever spoken by an American, I think, when he said, if every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid for by a drop of blood drawn by the sword, then the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous. So he's basically saying, if every one of us has to die because of what we've done with the sin of American slavery, that would be fine. Imagine a president saying that today. But then in the 20th century, when I have Martin Luther King and Dolores Huerta, it is the faith communities that were so central to those movements. King is obvious, not just to the Black church, but all the solidarity he got from other Christian denominations. Dolores Huerta, the speech I gave was a march that was designed to accompany Lent, to the State House Capitol in Sacramento. The progressive tradition of faith in this country has been so whitewashed by the fact that we have a kind of strain of Christian evangelical nationalism now. And I have Reagan in there speaking to the National Association of Evangelicals. And I think we've lost something if we forget that the DNA of so many social justice movements in this country had the Episcopal Church, had other Christian denominations, had Catholic Church, had the Jewish community in the Civil Rights Movement, obviously the Black church I mentioned. We do ourselves a profound disservice in thinking that religion and politics in this country is inherently conservative. It hasn't been anything but, if you look at our history.
So do you see that we are, within our common life in the Episcopal Church now, completely dedicated to opposing white Christian nationalism as, in our language, a heresy? Do you see that strain through all of American history, or is that a more recent disease?
It's always been there. So to just give two examples from history, Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederacy, was part of a common tradition in the South to draw upon the Bible to justify slavery, and that is somehow the natural state of things. Stephens called white supremacy and the philosophical, physical, and moral truth, and then he used the Bible to affirm that. Now, Lincoln, and boy, if I had more time and was probably a better historian, I want to nail this down. Lincoln, in the second inaugural, in rebuking slavery, quotes the same Bible verse as Stephens. So I think he was, in Stephens' speech, had been very famous. I think Lincoln, I don't want to say trolling because it's Abraham Lincoln, but I think he was directly engaging that argument. And so those arguments, you could look at the Bible and find a justification for slavery, and you could look at a Bible and find that that is the most morally important thing we can do. And so you see how religion can be taken by either side. I think the other thing, though, the chapter on Reagan was very interesting to write, because the speech I chose that Reagan gave is shorthanded as the Evil Empire speech. Some of you may know it. And it's famous for Reagan calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. But it's a speech to the National Association of Evangelicals, and the first 2/3 of the speech has nothing to do with foreign policy. It's about abortion, prayer in schools, all the things that have kind of accompanied our lifetime. And in researching that chapter, what I found was how much after the civil rights movement, and again, I knew this already, but it's going deeper, you can always learn more. After the civil rights movement, there was a need in the South to find, I guess, what Frederick Douglass once called, a way to put old wine in new bottles, a need to find a basis for maintaining the social order that had been disrupted by desegregation. And one way was to say, we want to be able to send our children to religious schools that don't have to be integrated. And that was at the same time that was an impulse, feminism was coming along. And there was a desire to say, well, wait a second, we want to kind of preserve a certain hierarchical gender construct in this country. At the same time that the gay rights movement came along after Stonewall down the street, and essentially there was a very concerted effort throughout the 70s to politicize Christian evangelicals in this country in a way that they never had been before. And because it was both a useful way to create an alternative basis for quote unquote states' rights, or keeping the godless federal government that is committed to things like civil rights out of our society. And so there was a lot of work done to lead up to the point where in 1983, Ronald Reagan is addressing evangelicals, who are now like a core component of a new political coalition that has been the predominant political coalition in American politics since, with the exception of the Obama coalition for 8 years. And so I say that because the conservative side has always been there, but it's taken effort. It's not natural. Like, Christians don't default to being, for, segregation or a certain patriarchy, right? They are pulled there. And if you look at the 250th anniversary of America, the idea that we're going to have a kind of a big Christian nationalist event on the South Lawn with a bunch of pastors who are connected to nothing but money-making megachurches, kind of tells you they're not connected to think of the lineage of the room we're in right now. Like, think of the lineage in this room. Like the Christian and activist lineage here. And compare that to the lineage that will be connected to whatever show they put on the South Lawn with, Trump's pastor, who, as far as I can tell, doesn't really have a church, We should never surrender the idea that that's American Christianity.
So what's the role of those who collaborate with those who speak, speechwriters? And you talked a little bit before about AI and the need for authenticity. As you evaluate these speeches, as you look at our common life and the narrative, what's the role of those who help or could help? And how does that strengthen and or detract from these voices?
Well, I think that on the role of speechwriters and then the role of that leads into a point about authenticity. I was one of two speechwriters on the speech Obama gave the night of the New Hampshire primary in 2008 that became the Yes We Can speech. whenever I tell people that, they kind of look a little disappointed that there were speechwriters on that speech and that Obama didn't just extemporaneously stand up and say those words. And what I would always tell them is, well, imagine if I gave that speech. Like, it'd be ridiculous, you know? Or imagine if, you know, John Kerry or Hillary Clinton or Al Gore gave that speech. It'd be ridiculous. Like, Barack Obama, that was his voice. You know, my job was not to write the best written speech. My job was to help Barack Obama say what he wanted to say, informed by who he was. And so at core, the role of collaborators is to remove yourself entirely from the process, and to help the person say what they want to say. I think more fundamentally, though, I always thought it wasn't enough, you know, sure, I studied Obama's voice, I read his autobiographies, I used to read the transcripts of all his interviews. I wanted to kind of, when I sat down to write, it was him, not me, like, you know, making the words. But then I also realized to kind of truly understand the voice, I had to understand where it came from. You know, what's the origin story? So Obama had clearly studied the cadences of King, you know, and so we spent a lot of time with the rhetoric of the civil rights movement. You know, in writing this book, I was really struck by the fact that I did King and then Huerta, and throughout the King chapter, there are all these lines that we ended up, you know, having used. You know, the fierce urgency of now, like the case for direct action, and I was kind of encountering how, oh, I see what Obama, I actually understand better now the genius of what Obama did. He took King's argument about direct action around civil rights, and he universalized it to everything, you know. So I'm gonna use the same language and the same story, but I can apply it to healthcare, you know, or ending the war in Iraq, and not just to civil rights. And then Huerta, you know, who's an underrated orator, Dolores Huerta, she is the one who coined the phrase "si se puede," which was a white governor, basically in a very, you know, racist and paternalist way, told her, no, you farm workers can't do this. And she said, "Si se puede," yes, we can. And we had known that we were using Dolores Huerta's slogan, the farm worker slogan. And it got me thinking what a weird country it is that two white male speechwriters were using the slogan of a Chicana woman for the voice of a black man. I mean, there's something hopeful about that. You know, like, that America is this kind of weird collaboration. Like, the whole country is a collaboration, you know? And I'd just say on the going forward, I was talking about AI, and I always tell people, like, whatever communication you're doing, a sermon, a speech, anything where you're standing up and talking to a group of people, you should keep in mind one question. How am I the only person on earth who could deliver this communication? Because if you don't know the answer to that question, you could give a good speech, but the thing that makes something connect is when people feel like they're connecting with the individual talking to them. Not just that the arguments are good, that they're learning something, not just about what that person wants to do, but why that person wants to do it. And again, that's what in the book, like, it was so important to me to say, like, okay, if you read it, like, most chapters, I don't get to the speech until, like, the end of the chapter, because we need to understand this person. Like, where did they come from? What happened to them? What was going on around them? What movement did they join? And only then can you understand kind of why these words connected.
Amory, do you want to take questions from the community?
So folks, I'll bring the microphone around. If you're interested in a question, just kind of wave so I can map it out.
Thank you so much. My question is, we're moved into such a different space now from just listening to speeches, or even I remember watching Barack Obama's speech about right.
Yeah.
I was about to be a senior in high school, and that was before social media came online. We're watching just clips and sections, and we live in an environment, we are awash with language, awash with words in a way that it's so much harder to discern what that truth is. And I'm wondering what thoughts you have about that as we move forward while we're also looking back.
No, it's a great question. Thank you for it. So I'd say another thing I learned is just how much like the nature of technology shapes how people receive stories. In Franklin's day, if he gave a speech, the only people who heard it were the people sitting in the room. But then those speeches were reprinted in newspapers. So the way they wrote speeches was almost like essays, like to be consumed in print. If you fast forward to Douglas in the middle of the 19th century, there was a speaker circuit. So people started traveling the country, giving the same speech hundreds of times. And actually they became almost like pop stars, because there were no pop stars back then. And so people came out to see speakers. And that was the golden age of, a lot of ways, American speaking and reform movements, because people would literally just town to town build the movement speech by speech. And that kind of, like all of a sudden, performance mattered a bit more. They weren't essays, they were rhetorical performances. Then radio comes along, and that prizes plain spoken explanation, because suddenly like you can reach people in their homes. And so FDR kind of cracks this code. Like I'm gonna, in very simple language, explain to you what's happening as if I'm sitting with you. And then television comes along, and then that prizes charisma and spectacle. And King and Kennedy thought a lot about that. You know, what does it look like? Can you feel the charisma coming through the screen? And then comes along the internet. And now, you know, at first, like, it was interesting, writing for Obama, it was kind of like, there was a period where, kind of like everything with the internet, there was a period where it was good because more people could just consume what you were saying. But then social media comes along. And so now we've been living through an era for the last 10 to 15 years where, I mean, when's the last time you heard a speech in full? It is cut into bits and pieces and then delivered to you literally by an algorithm that is designed to trigger you. So what you see is not only just a bit of a speech, it's a bit of a speech that is meant to make you angry about the people you disagree with, or to really reaffirm that you're right in what you believe. And in that context, your ability to make or listen to a whole argument kind of collapses. It's no coincidence that Trump has dominated that era, because when he gives a 1-hour speech at some rally, he knows that very few people, except like the diehard Fox News viewers, are gonna sit and watch that entire speech. But he also knows that it's going to be broken up into a million little clips and ricochet around the internet and have its intended effect of making me angry and making his people feel, emboldened. And I think that when I was writing the book, knowing that I was writing this book about, in part, speeches at a time when that doesn't exist in the same way, I was really struck by what we've lost by not having that anymore. And it made me really believe that there's part of the reason we're so disoriented, part of the reason we don't even share a national identity. We don't really, we feel less connected to people that we disagree with that happen to also be American, is because of the absence of that kind of common storytelling and listening. Or even just like knowing that even if someone may have heard a speech and had a different view than I did, at least I know that we all watched the same speech. Like when I was a kid, if I'm dating myself, but if Ronald Reagan gave a speech on television in prime time, I'd go to school the next day and assume that pretty much everybody watched it, that's gone. And so but I think that, and I may sound like a bit of a Luddite here, I think that we're gonna need to have to recapture the capacity to do political storytelling through speeches again to get out of this. Because if you think about it, I think the reason people put aside the right, I'll pick on my own side, I think one of the reasons people are so frustrated with Democrats right now is capitalism doesn't work. Nobody thinks that their kids are gonna have it better than they do. Inequality is running out of control. Jeff Bezos is buying the Met Gala for his second wife or what have you. We're at war. AI is like coming for our jobs, and I'm worried that my kids are going to be friends with chatbots. And then you see these politicians speaking in these carefully calibrated talking points about healthcare subsidies, because that's the thing that polls the best, or Biden and Harris used to talk about building an economy from the bottom up to the middle out. And I'm sure that focus group really well, but I have no idea what the heck that means. And there's a lack of authenticity, and there's a lack of storytelling, and the lack of someone saying, like, what is going on, And actually, I think if someone had the, audacity to say, I'm going to try to do that. I'm going to try to tell a story about how we got here and how we can get out of it, and make you believe that we can get out of it, that people would react to that. And that, frankly, as someone who's been in political communications, that doesn't mean you don't do the other things. But the reality is, if you know your story, then all the other communications flow more naturally. Like if you're even, so yeah, maybe you get up and you give that speech, and you give it again and again and again and again, and maybe not everybody sees it, but if you worked out what you believe through that story, through that speech, well, when you show up on the podcast, or when your team has to make the social media video, like, it's going to all be better, and people are going to sense intuitively that authenticity. So I actually, and I've written and even talked to some politicians about this. Like, I really believe that as we enter another cycle of presidential politics, the people that unlock this, I think they might find a more receptive audience for it than they might think.
Well, so who are the voices you admire right now? Maybe not necessarily the folks who are going to run for president or anything else, but the voices out there who you think are telling a story that's shaping the narrative.
Well, I think that if I look at politicians, one of the things that I find kind of interesting is some of the politicians that are doing this well are the younger ones. And so if I look at like a John Ossoff or a Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they have different. Ossoff gives a good speech, but it's also a coherent argument. It's one story. It's not just like he clearly gives thought into like, I'm going to connect these dots for you about how corruption impacts all the way down to why you're paying more for things. AOC does this thing that is common in the book, which is it's not necessarily that like she delivers the greatest oratory, but there's like a joyful fearlessness that she exudes when she's out in front of a crowd that is common to the people in this book, because you need to make people unafraid of power. She does not present, and Mamdani has this too, like she does not present as intimidated by the forces arrayed against her. That's half the battle, by the way. James Tallarico is doing this in Texas. He talks about, when I said to you, Matt, about not just the what do you want to do, but the why, well, when he talks about his faith, and then what that compels him to do for his neighbor, then it flows into a certain set of policies, and suddenly you don't know not just what he wants to do, but why he wants to do it. And then I do think you saw in miniature, in even people whose names I will never know in Minneapolis, but as we were all consuming videos from there, every now and then someone would stand up and talk about, I'm just here because I'm trying to help my neighbor, That's a values proposition. That's not like I'm here because I don't like Trump. I'm here because I don't want them to do this to my neighbor, and I don't know why they're doing this. And we all have a responsibility to each other. And so I think you're starting to see some of this percolate in the culture. But honestly, the other thing is people need to be a little less embarrassed. Sometimes I think we feel like we're going to come across as too earnest. We're in such a cynical time that kind of earnestness that is required to be aspirational, people can be a little shy about it, And I think the more people see other people doing that, that's the other thing in the book, it's contagious, There's a reason there was so much great oratory in the 60s. These people were literally tacking off of each other, King was making Kennedy better, and so I think that's what we need to recapture.
Other questions? What about the Pope? Yeah, what about the Pope?
So, I love the Pope. You know, he's done one thing, two things that he's done exceptionally well, three things. There's so many more, too. If he was a New Yorker and a Knicks fan instead of a Chicago, you know, it'd be even better. So number one, that point I made about fearlessness. Like when he called out the Iran war as an unjust war, and Trump attacked him, and he was asked about it the next day, he could have said a lot of things. He could have said, you know, well, here's my theory of just war, and this is why it's unjust, or he could have said, this is illegal for this reason. The one and only thing he said was, I'm not afraid of the Trump administration. And I thought that was so powerful and well chosen, because the problem we have in this country and around the world is how many people are afraid. Every law firm that's capitulated, every university that's capitulated, every foreign leader, every European leader that thinks that they can ingratiate their way in. Here's a man whose power is entirely about his, you know, kind of spiritual platform. I mean, the Vatican, how many armies does it have? I think that's why he chose that. You know, we do not need to be afraid. I'm not afraid. So that's, I think, one powerful lesson, and it speaks to how, you know, people can raise their voices. A second thing is, what I like about the Pope is he's going for the big questions, right? So he engages on immigration, he engages on the war, and then he chooses to make his big encyclical about artificial intelligence. He's not talking about Obamacare subsidies, if you know what I mean. Like, he's talking about the kind of existential questions that we're all feeling, and at a time when there is so little moral leadership in the world, New York Episcopal Diocese excluded, you know, here's somebody saying, like, this is more, we need to apply, and that was going to be the third thing, we need to apply a moral framework to these questions of policy, which seemingly is like a radical idea, even though it shouldn't be, you know. And so I think that's one of the reasons why he's resonated so much.
Thank you. Here and then there. Cynthia. Okay. Yay. Joyful fearlessness.
Yeah.
I did bring a sign. Why not Philly? I just want to say Philly loves Ben Rhodes.
Thank you.
Second thing, how do you get with your speeches with Lincoln, and my in-laws live with us, they're conservative, but they bring up Lincoln and how he's a Republican and the history of Democrats. How do you get Republicans to re-embrace Lincoln again instead of just using it as a one-off and then going back to Trump? Like, I've tried to have conversations. I've taken my kids several times to that Lincoln Memorial in DC and stuff. So I'm just having trouble with how my brain, like, they bring up Lincoln, I want to continue the conversation, but how to get them back to appreciating their original president the way we do.
So I love that. First of all, I'm hoping to get to Philly, specifically the National Constitution Center, which seems like a very apt place to go. Two things I'd say. So the first is just a little story from the book, but it leads into I think what might be a useful answer. So I talked about how in that second inaugural, like, he needed to find a meaning in what had happened. And what it represented was the final evolution of Abraham Lincoln, because, you know, he started as someone who opposed slavery's expansion, but did not oppose its abolition in the territories. Then he evolved to wanting to preserve the Union without abolishing slavery. Then he evolved to wanting to emancipate the slaves as kind of wartime necessity, right? But by the end of the Civil War, he more profoundly changed. And I kind of juxtaposed him with Frederick Douglass, who had been pushing Lincoln to change. And Douglass actually first sensed it in Lincoln when he met with him in 1864 in the White House, and Lincoln thought he was going to lose the election because the tide of the war hadn't decisively turned yet. And Lincoln asked Douglass, can you encourage the slaves to come north? Because I'm afraid I might lose, and we need to save as many of them as possible. And Douglass walked out being like, well, this man is, now he's kind of seeing the true meaning of abolition. But then he gets up and gives a speech where he basically makes the entire purpose of the United States redeeming itself for what happened. And Douglass is in the audience at the time. And Douglass had this line describing the speech where he said, it seemed as if the voices of all the Hebrew prophets were running through the man at the time, which people spoke in the 19th century in ways that were pretty cool. But then Douglass goes to see Lincoln. There's a receiving line at the White House. You used to be able to stand in line on Inauguration Day and shake the president's hand. And Douglass gets in line and they kick him out of line because black people aren't allowed to do that. Lincoln finds out about that and says, let Douglass back in. I want to see him. So Douglass gets to the front of the line and Lincoln says to him, Mr. Douglass, what did you think of my speech? And Douglass is like, hey, there are a lot of people here. I'll write you a letter, And he says, no, I'm more interested in your opinion of my speech than any other person in this country. And Douglass looks at him and says, Mr. President, that was a sacred effort. And that was it. I mean, think about it. That happened in this country, And I say that because if you trace the arc of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and this gets to your question more directly, they've been remade so many times. Like, the Republican Party was founded as an anti-slavery party, and they dominated, they had the predominant share of the black vote in this country until 1964. And it's not a coincidence that after the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, no Democrat has carried the old Confederacy except Jimmy Carter in 1976. It flipped, The Republican Party, the Democratic Party, by contrast, was a white supremacist political party in this country for a very long time. The Republican Party was a progressive party in the early 20th century. Like, they passed some of the most important progressive reforms, antitrust, anti-big business. We can go on and on through time, but the point is that I think sometimes we have these tribal affiliations now with these political parties when they're not fixed institutions, I mean, just look at so to be specific to your in-laws, I'm sure that probably if they're diehard Republicans, 20 years ago, they were probably free traders, or they probably supported the war in Iraq. And now Donald Trump comes along and he's for tariffs. And the point being is that our allegiance should not be, I don't expect anyone to agree with all my views because I'm sure some of my views are wrong. But our allegiance shouldn't be just to some name of a party. It should be to the things that we actually believe in. And these parties can change. I mean, part of what I'd say is maybe stay a Republican and change this party. That'd be healthy, by the way. That'd be great. In the same way that I think the Democratic Party needs to change. That I think we've become. This is why it was very helpful to write a book about 250 years of American history. There's an extreme presentism today, where we kind of can't remember beyond a few years ago and can't think beyond tomorrow. And we think everything is fixed. And, if I don't like the Republican Party, I think it's going to be exactly the same 10 years from now, when the Republican Party of today is very different than it was 20 years ago. Let's all step back from our dogma, as Franklin would tell us, from our dogmatic fixation on the rightness of this party or that party, and just think about what are the things that I would like to see happen in this country. Because if the Republican Party can change so much, so many times too, it's not just one evolution from Lincoln to Trump. It's been a journey, in the same way that the Democratic Party has been a journey. The Democratic Party had, some of the most staunch segregationists in the history of this country were Democratic governors in the 60s, George Wallace, was a Democrat once. So I think what I'd say is pull back the lens and realize that none of this is fixed, and be guided by a set of values and not by a set of affiliations to a party, or even just a set of affiliations to policies, because some policies might make sense at one time and not another.
Cynthia? And then Cynthia, and then Cynthia, then in the front.
Just kind of addressed the presentism of sorts. And I'm wondering if, for example, we have these documents, these founding documents that, including the Bible, the Constitution, Declaration, et cetera, and often both parties will refer to aspects of those documents. However, we have such an uneducated public that has no idea of what those documents mean. And so, I'm thinking about as the Department of Education has been dismantled, and as, we're not teaching social studies and history in classes or giving it the time that it needs, this idea of civics education, I'm wondering if it is the social responsibility of our social leaders and our political leaders to throw out some wisdom every now and then, to help people when they're talking about their issues that we're dealing with today, help the public understand how these documents came to be, and how can these documents be integrated into the conversation so that we are actually teaching in the public. And it's like, public education is happening through the ideas of our political forces going out there and having conversations, asking people to vote, but really getting a true understanding of these living documents. They're not fixed, as you say. And often we will, think about things in the present, the way things were written back in the past, and find all kinds of excuses for how we need to stick with the originalist of it all, when in fact these documents are meant to live and change and go with society as it changes from day to day. So I'm wondering if, is it possible for our so-called leaders, candidates, etc., to use the arena of our learning and our understanding as a place of education for people to know what those things mean?
Yeah, it's a great question and kind of great directional point. Because actually, even before our present mess, something did go wrong when all of a sudden the founding documents became these like stone tablets, and you think of them as literally like that, because actually when you go back, the liveliness of the debate about them is extraordinary the farther back you go. Douglas, for instance, had a huge falling out with William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison, the most famous white abolitionist, the man that discovered Douglas in many ways and put him on the circuit. And they had a falling out over the Constitution because Garrison was like, this is written by a bunch of white slaveholders, and we just have to toss it out and start over again. And Douglas is like, when I look at that Constitution, I see a profoundly anti-slavery document. Now, I know I can see the Fugitive Slave Clause and the Three-Fifths Compromise. I choose to look at this other stuff, and I need to kind of make my argument. I want to work within this system to change it, And that, like, two men could look at it totally differently from a totally shared political objective. I come down on Douglas's side. Like, he's like, let's amend this thing. Let's draw the thread from what I like and make it better, right? And I think that I'll speak, people who are more progressive have weirdly let, in part, and here I'll be critical, we've become too garrison, this is an irredeemably screwed up nation, and these documents are written by, a bunch of white supremacists, and therefore, because the problem with that is, even if some of that's true, we then surrender the legacy to those that make originalist arguments, instead of, saying, no, that's, the title I chose from the book is King the Night Before He Was Killed. All we say to America is be true to what you put on paper, which I love, because it sums everything up, And he's talking about the Declaration of Independence. Every single progressive person in this book, and by coincidence, used the hypocrisy of the Declaration of Independence to make their argument. Those documents give us a lot to work with, despite the flaws of the people that wrote them. And so, number one, I think that we have to kind of engage in these documents as living things, precisely to make them work for us, not to deify the people who wrote them. But then number two, look, I'm no conspiracy theorist, but the systematic defunding of education in this country over the course of the last 45 years coincides precisely with the effort to roll back the civil rights movement, to entrench an oligarchy in this country, and to ultimately begin dismantling democracy in this country. And so I think people that, whether they're left, center left, or right, who care about democracy, education is far lower on the totem pole than it should be as a matter of public policy. I think it's ripe for people to come along and say there needs to be a massive reinvestment in education in this country, to include civic education. And then I do think leaders need to, again, Obama, again, not here to say he was perfect, but the speech in here is called A More Perfect Union. It's all about the fact that the Constitution gave us a blueprint that could lead all the way up to a candidacy of Barack Obama. He was situating intentionally himself in the continuum of American history. He was saying, I, a black man running for president, with Jeremiah Wright as my pastor in 2008, I'm of the lineage of this document. He gave this speech at the National Constitution Center, where I'd like to visit, for that reason. And I think it's important, and again, people can disagree, and I have friends, progressive friends who disagree, but I think you're more likely to persuade and move things if you don't kind of step outside the continuum and say, this has all been wrong, and say, I'm going to fight for the lineage of this document. And that means I have to educate people about this document and what it was and what it wasn't. I have to educate people about how it's changed. Douglas, I stumbled upon the greatest rebuke of originalism I've ever seen in this document, in this book, in writing this book, which is Douglas said, because originalism was around back in those days, Douglas said, how is it that we must take into account the original intent of the men that authored the Constitution, but not the men that authored the 14th Amendment? Pretty good argument.
One final question.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I have a lot of thoughts here, and I'm going to try and. It's late, so I'm moving on. First of all, I just want to say, I think talking about the long view of history, I think religion and the religious stories that we grow up with, even if you're not of a religious nature, we know the stories, and I think that's really great for moving out of presentism, because it gives you the idea that there is a long view. Next, as Bishop Hyde knows, my husband is an Episcopal priest, and I live in CD 17, and there is a tension in our household between him taking the long view every week in the speech he writes, which is amazing, because I was just thinking, I don't know where else people get speeches, and then I do more direct political action advocacy. And as you probably know, in CD17, there's a big primary coming up for the person who's going to fight Lawler. And I'm thinking a lot about what you're saying about the stories that we tell about ourselves and as our fellow Americans, trying to reach our fellow Americans. The different people in the primary up there, they're similar in a lot of ways. We're starting to see some fractures. And I'm worried that, I wouldn't call it infighting, but we're trying to reach each other and talk to each other and tell these stories. And I don't know that the same old patterns of the political activism are working. And we really need it to work, at least in CD17. And I wanted to know, this is all leading to a question about your theory on the tactics of this. So a lot of nationwide groups like Swing Left are doing something, a movement called Ground Truth, which is basically a take on deep canvassing.
Yeah.
And
I'm familiar with it, yeah.
What you think about the effort behind the concept of deep canvassing that enables us to talk to each other if we can't give a speech like a Douglas or a Kennedy or an Obama, or if we're not preaching from the pulpit. Would something like that engagement with your neighbors be a way of telling those stories to each other? I just don't know if it's a proven thing yet.
I love the question. And so for people to follow, like deep canvassing is, it's interesting because the Obama campaign in 2008 was the ultimate, evangelism for a certain kind of door knocking, which was you build field organization, you motivate people, and they go out and they knock on doors and they make the case, right? And that's kind of been the premise of Democratic politics since. And I think that worked well for us, but I also think there are a couple things missing. One is, if I looked at the last campaign, I think Kamala Harris had like a big organizing network and did a lot of door knocking. Trump had those rallies. Those rallies felt more community oriented than anything we were doing. It's not my idea of a good time to go to a MAGA rally, but those people looked like they were having fun. They were wearing hats and shirts and, doing whatever they did. But the reason people door knocked for us is because they also felt that they were in a community and that they were having a good time. They were joyful. So before getting to deep canvassing, I think a really important point I would leave people with is, particularly people who are on a certain side of the political aisle here, like we have been understandably angry about a lot of things for the last decade. And I think, if anybody who follows me knows I'm angry all the time. But I step back and think, well, what a trap, because when you're angry and kind of grim, there's kind of a grim energy in every Democratic campaign of the Trump cycle, It's not a lot of fun, It's not, and so I do think one thing that's missing is, how do you make participatory politics and activism community-oriented and enjoyable? Again, to wade into local politics, like Mamdani did this ingeniously here. I was watching, tragically, from Los Angeles, but those people, when he's having scavenger hunts and people want to go hang out with their friends and work for this campaign. Whether you don't have to like Mamdani, it's more a point about tactics of am I building a movement that looks like other people will be attracted to it for reasons other than just that they're really angry, Don't get me wrong, anger has been a very motivating force for me. So that's kind of one point, is that I think we need, whether it's in activism, look, the No King stuff is kind of fun. You get to go see a bunch of cool signs. My kids like to go. That's good. That's they're figuring something out there. There's humor in it, Then the deep canvassing, which involves listening, right? It involves conversation. So the idea for people to follow this is, We're not just going to knock on doors and kind of be like, you should vote for this Democrat. We're going to go and have a conversation with our neighbors, and we're going to listen to them and kind of begin a communication. That's actually like, when we canvassed for Obama in Iowa, which we all had to do, at the beginning we were told to do that. We were told not to ask for their vote. We were told to come in and ask them what they were interested in, what issues were they most worried about. And then, only then, say, like, how can we get you more information on that? And then we'd return and return again. But I think more fundamentally, so I think that's a good strategy by Swing Left, and I think Indivisible is doing some of it too. But I think that what, like, I'm struck by as somebody who is often isolated, and I'll speak personally now. Like, I write alone in a room. When I do, like, go on television, I'm staring at a green dot on my computer screen. When I, do a podcast, I'm just having a conversation with one other person. I love this. I've missed community. I've missed being in a public or semi-public space with other people, including strangers. And I can't imagine I'm alone. Like, I think people in this country are tremendously isolated. I also think that there are some people that you're just never going to reach. They're going to slam the door in your face. But it's not most people. And frankly, Obama used to tell us, remember, 30% of this country would have voted for George Wallace. So let's put those people aside for a second. I actually think that they don't want, I think people are tired of, like, hating each other. And, yeah, sure, maybe the person that watches, like, 12 hours of Fox News but, like, so I think that in addition to, like, what I said about creating kind of joy and about listening, I think just trying to find ways to create different interactions in groups, be very deliberate about, we're going to get people together, whether it's like a canvas or a potluck dinner or a church event or whatever the thing is. I also think people want to do something. Like, when ICE came to LA, everybody I knew was like, what can I do? Like, I want to help. And what that led to is, like, I actually would like to meet more undocumented people because I'd like to do something, like, I think giving outlets for people to meet people that they haven't met and to have conversations they haven't had could unlock a lot of energy, and the church actually is a great vehicle for that, because look at this.
Final question. There's a Ghanaian word, Sankofa, which means usable history. And so you've talked about the two currents in American history. And you've written about the history we have and the interplay between those currents. But if you were to think about not just the history we have, but the future we want with the current that you described that President Obama and you have worked on and lifted up, this struggling towards our ideals, which has been the best of us, the most prophetic part of our movements, what speeches would you include in that book that maybe aren't in this one?
That have not been written, you mean?
Or that you talked about originally that about Selma.
Selma, yeah.
The Selma, but are there other speeches we should, as we think about our agency and our work and our narrative, what else would you include?
Well, the Selma speech is a good one, and it's a good one to kind of end on, because actually I originally intended to end my book with this speech. So Barack Obama gave a speech in 2015 at the 50th anniversary of the march in Selma, Bloody Sunday. It's his favorite speech. And it is an incredibly triumphalist speech about the progressive narrative of American history. Now, I'll come back to that in a second, but then Trump won, and my editor's like, how do you feel about that ending? He's very good at not telling me what to do, but, And I was like, maybe it's not the right ending, And so actually the race speech is a much more appropriate speech for the time. And then the Trump second inaugural is unfortunately where the story is currently, but it's not where the story ends. To the point about presentism, there is a huge effort that has always been made in this country to make you think that the story's over, to fill you with cynicism, nothing matters, or apathy, nothing can change. Every time there's a reactionary surge, which we've had periodically, right? I mean, if we could just start at the Civil War, you have Reconstruction, then you get segregation and lynching, you get a progressive movement, then you get this kind of weird 1920s isolationism and, small government. Then you get, the civil rights movement, and then you get Nixon, and then you get Obama, and then you get Trump. Like, this is not new. However, each time the wave of change extends a bit further. So when the tide comes back, you're starting higher up than you did, if you know what I mean? Like, and that's the point I made earlier about Douglas and Chinese immigration. Look where we are. Now, to go back to the Selma speech, like what Obama does, and the part I would look to is he I don't have it at the tip of my tongue, but he essentially says, we are X, Y, and Z, and he lists, the founding fathers. But then he says, we are also, and then he begins, I mean, it's funny, I was participating in the writing of the speech, and the speechwriter, Cody Keenan, called me up, and he said, Obama has a great idea. He wants us to just build our canon of heroes. And it's a wild journey, because we're all just adding in, everybody from, Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and Mark Twain, and we're Lewis and Clark, but we're also Sacagawea, like, and we all the way up through, Dolores Huerta, and the point is that, like, there's a patriotism that will be on display at the 250th anniversary of this country that suggests, I mean, actually, you want to hear something funny? Google Donald Trump's speech at Mount Rushmore, because he clearly had read, because he's so obsessed with Obama, he did this, and he did his own list of heroes. He said, America is, and he was like, Frank Sinatra and Bob Hope, It's remarkable, actually. It's so funny. But I read that, I say read that because, in addition to any word ever spoken by Frederick Douglass, who emerged from this book as, in my mind, maybe our most towering American, because it's just a reminder that, like, America is not like a story just about a bunch of powerful people doing dumb things. It is that, but the story look where we are, like the neighborhood. We are a nation that has been defined by underdogs, like the people that came out of nowhere, like the people that surprised you, the people that were the unlikely, like Patti Smith and Allen Ginsberg. Like, those people are as American as Jeff Bezos, more American in my view, right? And so I think we need to kind of, and again, this is like a very untrendy thing to say, but like we need to recover like our patriotism, which doesn't mean it's the flag and it's like or even the East Wing. I'm sad that got torn down. It's Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad and Chinese laborers and Red Jacket, and like these people are America. There's a lot of effort being put into telling you that they're not, but they are. And so what that Selma speech is about to me is like, this is our patriotism. Like, this is our lineage. And if we extend that lineage forward, we always win. We always win. We've never lost. It just sometimes takes a really long time.
That's a great place to close. Amory, do you want to say a word about Season of Freedom as we close?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much. Yeah, and just to say, we've talked a little bit in this community about Charlotte Eiffel and the idea that we are in a planting season rather than a harvest season. And so that what you said about Frederick Douglass, just like not shrinking away still from speaking and having the courage to speak truth, even if it might not be heard or received or or put into action in our, I'm hoping in my lifetime, maybe I'm hoping we're not, but that we may not see it immediately. And I'm also struck by just what you said about collaborating, that I think in some ways there's so much emphasis on cultivating our own platforms and voices. It's like, it was really striking to hear what you said about the power of collaborating to lift up a voice or to lift up a speech. And I think in our communities, because we have a strong community here at St. Mark's, that's interesting for us to think about. How are we lifting up voices strategically at this time? We're launching the Diocese of New York, which is an idea that started at St. Mark's a while back, and now thinking about this 250th anniversary, thinking about a season of freedom for the church, but that we would share with the wider world, to invite us all into a conversation about what does it mean to be America at this time, starting the season on Juneteenth and continuing through July 4th, and that'll be a series of conversations. And I think the conversation really started tonight, but then a series of conversations, public witness, actions, social media engagement, and other things like that. Would love for everyone to be part of that. So you can stay for books in the back and snacks and.
No, I tell you, I've had this, like, with my, every time I finish,
I'm sorry, I didn't get my question out.
My favorite 50 animals. Young, ambitious, yeah. So the currents continue.
I think it's like community dependent in the sense of like, I'm in LA. Like, there's this organic, set of organizations that came together around us. But they didn't end. You know what I mean? Like, they kept, now they're working on city council races. And so I think we're at a season, to use Levin's point, that where, like, there's that local, like globalization, and then moving on and on. So I honestly think it's kind of like looking around and like who's doing stuff at the local level that I can get a part of, that connects to like whatever the issue is that is of mine. My immigration is front and center everywhere. So I do think some of the mobilization happens everywhere. And then there are these organizations in which you mentioned some of them are invisible. They're the people that don't know things. There's national infrastructure. But I actually think it's like a local era. That's my opinion. Let's see.
We are the stick men.
Oh my goodness!
We are here. We're here to buy books for Ben Stickney.
All right. Yeah. So Taylor Branch's book was absolutely like the King chapter leans very heavily. Notes show it, so it's credited. But boy, his books are credited.
My name is Steve.
So the best part about it is
I sent you an email.
so I read all of his King biography.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So,
We are going to be here next week.
How's Ben doing?
Great, he's with CNN.
I saw Kimani last night.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, I did. Exactly the same. Kimani and Regina.
I love Kimani and I love the Mets.
Yeah, yeah.
Hey, listen,
No, I'm in LA, so I'll email Ben.
to be continued, but
Yeah.
Taylor will be thrilled. They're
Yes.
coming here next week.
Give him my best.
All right.
Told to